And thanks so much for tuning in to Morning Live. Now, tomorrow marks Africa Day, the annual commemoration of the foundation of the Organization of African Unity on the 25th of May, 1963. And in light of this, the Swahili Language Board of Southern Africa says that by learning Kiswahili, many Africans are better equipped to speak to others and understand each other. And to tell us more about this, I'm joined now by Zukile Jama from the Swahili Language Board of Southern Africa, and he's in our Sea Point studio in Cape Town. And welcome, Jambo, Zukile.
Jambo, habari yako?
Well, I've exhausted my quota of Kiswahili for the morning, just about. But, it is a very interesting discussion all the same, because from movies like The Lion King, we know a little bit, Rafiki, we know means friend, we know Jambo means hello, but it's very basic, it's very conversational at the very least. So why do you think it's important that we ought to pay attention to a language such as Kiswahili?
I think firstly, let me start by saying we want to acknowledge the founding members of the OAU, whose main purpose was for the unification of Africa, in other words, promoting the unity amongst Africans. And we therefore think Kiswahili can play a prominent role in terms of continental unity. Because if you look at the languages of the African Union, all right, most of them, almost all of them, they are not indigenous languages. And Kiswahili is an indigenous African language in both its design and formation. It is very similar also to our local languages. So I think for us South Africans to learn Kiswahili, it's not a daunting task. It would give us an opportunity, for instance, to communicate with each other without using a mediation of a colonial language. And also because we have a contingent of migrants from across the continent for whom Kiswahili is the first language. So for South Africans to communicate with this language serves a very important purpose, for instance, in combating issues such as xenophobia, because people then begin to speak to each other instead of speaking with each other.
How many Kiswahili speakers are there across the continent?
Well, before we talk about speakers, we would have to take the geographic distribution of this language, right from the borders of Somalia, right into Mozambique and inland into DRC. It's estimated that there are between 100 and 150 million speakers. It is the most widely spoken African language. It's the most globally distributed African language taught in universities around the world, including Asian countries.
So talking about, the social cohesion and other benefits that one would derive from actually learning to speak this very widely spoken language on the continent, how do you propose we go about it as a nation such as South Africa, where we have several of our own indigenous languages, and so many people struggle to learn these languages? How would you then go about encouraging people to learn a language like Kiswahili?
First, let me point out clearly that I think there is a legislative framework which is supposed to be looking to that. As in the country, I think they have the Pensad Act, which needs to operate in that space. But for us is to look in particular with the relationship between us South Africans and the rest of the continent. But for us, for our languages, if we, for instance, we're talking in terms of intellectualization of our languages, we have a language like Swahili, which almost has 2,000 years of being documented, which was standardized in 1928. So I think in terms of intellectualization of our languages, we have a language which we can use as a benchmark. In a country such as Tanzania, it is used as a medium of instruction, even at tertiary institutions. So in terms of intellectualizing our languages, we have a language that we could use as a benchmark.
So
and if I may add also, I did allude to the fact that in learning, for instance, different second languages for our local languages, we always use English as a medium. It would be very important that also we could have another African language which we could use.
So in South Africa, for example, where would one go if you wanted to learn Kiswahili? Because one of the other issues for me is that we shouldn't just be talking about this because it's Africa Day, because surely this is something that lives well beyond that.
Yes, definitely. For instance, for us as the South African Language Board, we have a wing which is called Kiswahili for Africa, which we use to teach people this language. And also we have quite a network in which we integrate with other local people and try to teach this language. And if I may talk about myself, when I started with this project, I started with it 15 years ago, and I started a department at the University of Cape Town teaching Kiswahili. And with the announcement by the Minister of Basic Education that Kiswahili is going to be taught at schools, it gives us more motivation, for instance, to move towards an establishment of a chair of Kiswahili in a South African university.
Well, that's very interesting. But what do you say to those South Africans who ask, so if we are learning Kiswahili in South Africa, are people in other parts of the continent, the countries that you've mentioned where the language is spoken, do they get to learn South African indigenous languages, or is this just a one-way street?
That is what we mean by social cohesion. As the South African Swahili Language Board of Southern Africa, our other aim is to be able to create space for our migrants from across the continent to learn and interact in our local languages. And as I'm speaking to you now, I am working on a multilingual, multimedia program in which people can learn Kiswahili by using their own local languages. In other words, creating a program, for instance, where you can click, for instance, Dumelang, and then it will give you a voice prompt of what you would say in Kiswahili in Hujambo. If you would click on a Sotho phrase, which is Ligai, for instance, and then it would create a voice prompt in Kiswahili, say Abarigani.
So where can we get that?
This is a work in progress, but there is a program which I completed when I was at UCT. It is called Tuseme Kiswahili. It is also a multimedia program that we used to teach our students when I was at UCT. Unfortunately, I had to leave UCT and do some other things.
Well, it sounds very fascinating. And of course, this as we go into Africa Day, a message perhaps to the South African public for Africa Day?
What I would like to say first, because it is Africa Day, I was going to say nawasalimia wa Afrika wote ambayo wanatoka nchi za jirani au nje ya South Africa, na kuambia kwamba karibuni South Africa. South Africa ni nchi yetu sote.
And the translation.
And for South Africa, I was saying I was welcoming all our neighbors and all our visitors who are coming to enjoy the Africa Day, and also for the President of South Africa, Matamele, would like to say kwa Kiswahili hongera, which means congratulations. For the rest of South Africans, I think they have to embrace Kiswahili as investing in a language like Kiswahili is going to have economic spin-offs, because it empowers them to open up to those who are coming out of the continent, and it's also going to give them space if they need to get work somewhere in Africa.
Well, for your time this morning, Zukile Jama, asante sana.
Na mimi pia nimeshukuru.
Well, thank you so much. And Zukile Jama from the Swahili Language Board of Southern Africa, they advocating that everyone on the continent should learn the language to communicate with each other, to foster social cohesion. And as he said, there are economic spin-offs, benefits to be had by knowing how to communicate in a language that is spoken by a vast majority of people on the continent.